On average, there are 73 work-related deaths in New Zealand every single year. 73.
70 New Zealanders died on the job last year, according to WorkSafe, and tens of thousands were injured.
New Zealand currently has a 60% higher workplace fatality rate than Australia and 500% higher than the UK.
The stats are alarming, so our government hit the road for feedback for change.
And the feedback on WorkSafe was stark. It was really bad. There was a huge culture of fear around our regulator for health and safety.
So the government has made changes and they're on the way.
The government wants to shift the focus of WorkSafe from enforcement to engagement.
But what does this mean and will it work? Kia ora, I'm Amanda Gillies, and on The Detailed today, workplace safety and WorkSafe. Why is the workplace not a safe place in New Zealand? Why is it a death trap for at least 70 Kiwis a year? And will the government's latest changes to workplace health and safety make a difference?
My instinct is no, because I think it's missing so many critical parts of what a good system would look like. And most important of that is it's absolutely missing the place of workers and worker voice. So I think on balance, I think overall, no, I think the answer is no. I don't think we are likely to see any improvement in health and safety from these changes.
That was journalist and author Rebecca McPhee, who has written extensively about workplace failures, including a recent article for Newsroom. More from her in a moment, along with Newsroom political editor Laura Walters. I also asked the Minister for WorkSafe Relations and Safety, Brooke van Velden, to be a part of this podcast, but she declined. But she did speak to Jack Tame on Q&A at the weekend about why the government is instructing WorkSafe to be kinder and more supportive to businesses and to shift its focus from enforcement to advice. She says up until now, many workers and businesses have been confused by the rules and the regulations and have feared prosecution. Let's start by listening to what she said to Jack.
We have to focus on reducing workplace deaths and serious injuries before we start sweating the small stuff. So I'm asking WorkSafe to focus on critical injury and death, and asking businesses to identify those critical injuries and deaths and go after them and reduce those, rather than, posters on hot water taps or is the toaster too hot? Right. Using a bit of common sense.
So how can we be sure that your changes won't lead to more deaths? How can we be sure that these changes won't lead to negative outcomes?
Well, because the whole point behind it is recognising that we do have too many people dying at work, and I would like to reduce that.
She says WorkSafe will still be prosecuting, but she wants a focus on genuine negligence of health and safety. She doesn't want to see, in her words, novel cases of prosecution like what happened after the Whakaari White Island eruption.
Individual charges against the owners of Whakaari White Island, the Buttle brothers, has been thrown out.
The judge was critical of WorkSafe's investigation, saying there wasn't enough evidence to continue.
Whakaari White Island erupted in 2019, killing 22 people. It followed the 2010 explosion in the Pike River mine, which killed 29 workers, a tragedy that led to the creation of WorkSafe in 2013 and a major overhaul of health and safety law in 2015. But still, the workplace deaths continue, many of them violent, most of them avoidable.
A union leader says the fall that led to the death of a Chinese migrant at work could have been avoided.
Another death at Auckland's port has prompted a call for a wider inquiry into safety issues in the industry. It's the fourth death at the port since 2017.
Over the last year and a half, at least 2 workers have died in construction every month, with just over 1 worker seriously injured every day.
37-year-old Jion Jiang fell from a height at a warehouse on Auckland's North Shore when moving aluminium extrusions. He died last night when his life support was turned off after he spent more than 10 days in a coma. Ambulance notes say Jiang was not wearing any safety harness or helmet when the crew arrived at the scene.
Q Act urging WorkSafe to soften its tone, sharpen its focus and become an enabler of safe work not just an enforcer of compliance. Political editor Laura Walters says the changes are on brand for ACT.
This is an important area for ACT in terms of workplace relations, in terms of employment relations, negotiations, workplace settings. This is important for ACT for those reasons around reducing, in their terms, unnecessary red tape, in terms of, reducing that kind of intervention from government and just letting people get on with business and try and lift productivity. This is core ACT stuff. And it's consistent with a lot of other changes that we've seen from this coalition government, especially changes that have been led by ACT Party ministers. So if you think about the ACT Party ideology or the principles that underpin a lot of what they push for, it's allowing the free market to kind of do their thing to reduce some of the regulatory burden on businesses. We always talk about New Zealand having a productivity problem, and if you were to ask, those ACT Party ministers, including Minister Brooke van Velden, they would point to these, this unnecessary red tape and regulatory burden. So it kind of sits within that broader sphere of workplace health and safety reforms, and this is just, the latest cab off the rank.
Is this a win for ACT? I mean, how are these changes being received?
It's really early days, and it's hard to know whether it's going to be a win for ACT until we actually see the effect of the changes. So that's one, and also, the biggest test of all always comes at election time, doesn't it? So knowing whether this is really welcomed by businesses will be the first one. I mean, you could imagine that it would be. A lot of these businesses that Van Velden has been speaking to on this big roadshow that she's been on around workplace health and safety reforms, they are asking for some of this stuff. They're asking for this regulatory burden to be lessened. They're also asking for, a little bit less of an enforcement or kind of a punitive approach to be taken from WorkSafe. That's what she said she heard from businesses. So you can imagine that those businesses that have been calling for that will be happy. They'll be welcoming these changes. Of course, the impact that this is going to have is unknown. And we saw this with some of the documentation that's come out in terms of the cabinet paper and things that accompanied the announcement on the WorkSafe changes, that there's just not a lot of evidence underpinning this at the moment, and that has been admitted as well by the minister. So, what kind of impact that this is going to have still remains to be seen. In theory, I think what the minister is hoping is that by reducing some of the kind of unnecessary regulations and instead focusing in on what she refers to as critical risk, so areas that could lead to serious workplace injuries or deaths, is the way to go. And if that indeed plays out, that's great. As we know, we have a really high rate of workplace deaths in New Zealand, but as I say, there's very little evidence. I think she actually said no specific evidence in this area yet to kind of underpin this. So, the results remain to be seen.
Yeah, because put simply, all people want to know is, will these changes save lives in the workplace? What's your take on that?
It's so very hard to know. I mean, we have such high rates of workplace deaths in New Zealand, and when you look at comparable jurisdictions, the UK and Australia, they have lower rates of deaths. We also see in Australia that they have higher number of these enforcement officers, and one of the things that the minister has said is that she wants to increase the number of enforcement officers, but she's not going for a specific ratio per 100,000 people in the population like Australia has gone for. So it is really, really hard to know what the impact of these reforms are going to be. Of course, on one side, you've got businesses saying that a lot of this is just unnecessary, silly stuff. You see examples, and, politicians love to pull out these little anecdotal examples like, signs above the hot water tap warning people that the hot water is going to be hot. That's such an unnecessary regulation. And when businesses are focusing on that type of regulation, they're not focusing on regulations that actually are going to keep their workers safe and make sure that their workplace is a safe place to be. And that's all fine and good, and that may be the result, that there can be the focus shifted just to the critical risk area. But people who are opposing this, including unions and others, we've heard the Labour Party come out against this as well, have said that, these regulations were put in place for a reason. They are there for a reason, and watering down those regulations and those standards, those minimum standards, are not the right way to go. Also, there's a reason that WorkSafe has a strong enforcement arm, and we've seen, them use that after, disasters such as the Whakaari White Island eruption. We know that a lot of these regulations and the way that WorkSafe is currently structured came after the Pike River disaster, and I think that nobody wants to see something like that happen again. When we're thinking about workplace deaths, we often think about Pike River or Whakaari, and then of course there are others in, high risk areas like forestry, construction, agriculture, things like that, and the last thing people want is for a watering down of regulations or watering down of the strength of the enforcement agency to lead to further deaths.
What about the Labour Party? Have they come out strongly on this? What are they saying?
Not as strongly as I would have expected. They have said that they don't think this is the right move. They say that, we do have high rates of workplace death in New Zealand, that these deaths happen quickly, and that any kind of, as we say, watering down of regulations, of safety standards, of enforcement abilities from WorkSafe could potentially lead to further workplace deaths. But that's kind of where their commentary has ended. And the Labour Party is, by definition, and as its name states, is a party that was set up to be for working people. And I'm thinking ahead to next year's election when Labour's going to be going after that, kind of mythical unicorn of middle New Zealand, working class middle New Zealand, the types of workers that these regulations and these rules are meant to keep safe. When they're going after those voters and pitching to them, you think that this would be kind of a core area that they could get cut through on. So I would have expected them to come out faster, stronger, more proactively on this. But who knows, potentially, in the coming months, they might do that as we see some of these changes bed in and see the impacts that that's actually going to have on how WorkSafe operates.
Rebecca McPhee has come out fast and strong on the changes. She has written a lot about workplace failures and deaths, including a book on the Pike River mine disaster. She's not convinced by the changes to WorkSafe.
I've just known so many of these stories, written about so many of them. They keep on happening. We keep on killing 70, 80 workers a year in this country, and nobody can be satisfied with that. And so change and improvement is drastically needed. And I guess, my response to the proposed changes announced by the Minister, Van Velden, is that they're not getting to the kind of change that's actually needed. On one hand, she's proposing to dial back on enforcement against businesses and increase guidance. I mean, the increased guidance part of that is good. The dialing back on enforcement, I think, is not. But quite apart from that, the inconsistency is that while she's talking about dialing back on enforcement of businesses, she wants to go harder on workers. She says she's being told by businesses that workers sometimes break the rules or don't put on a safety harness or whatever, and she wants to see more prosecutions of workers. So that seems pretty brazenly inconsistent to me. She also wants to, it's not clear what this is going to look like yet, but she wants to reduce the obligations on directors. And one of the big learnings from the Pike River disaster was I call it the incuriosity, the lack of curiosity, the lack of active knowledge and inquiry by that board into issues relating to the safety of the mine. And an important finding from the Royal Commission, and that went forward into the new law in 2015, was much more explicit duties on directors. And it now appears that that's going to be dialed back. Now, if that board at Pike had taken notice of the blazing red flags that were being waved in front of them, if they had taken notice of what workers were reporting, if they had inquired with the kind of curiosity and inquiry and scepticism that I think is required of a board of directors, the outcome may well have been very different. And likewise, it was the Department of Labour that was the government agency that looked after health and safety back then and had the power to enforce and prosecute. I mean, there were never any prosecutions against Pike River Coal, and the inspectors were very kind of, friendly and supportive and answered Pike's questions whenever they had questions. And never raised a finger against the company, despite the fact that, there were countless instances that they could have justifiably shut the place down. Now, the minister now is wanting WorkSafe as the regulator and the enforcer to go gently, be more supportive, be prepared to help. I mean, on one level, that's fine. Yes, the support and guidance is needed, but we need serious enforcement as well.
She says good health and safety regimes rely on an effective regulator, that's WorkSafe here, competent management in companies, and worker involvement. Now, that third leg has never been properly played out in this law, as it wasn't previously in the old law that applied from 90 to mid-90s. So if you really want to deal with some of the most grievous failings in health and safety, we were serious about it, we would start to attend to our lack of active involvement of worker voice in health and safety. But that's nowhere in this. I mean, it was watered down right back in 2015, 2016 when the current Act was brought in. If anything, the minister, who also deals with industrial relations issues, the workplace generally, workplace and health and safety, is very actively watering down worker rights. So just to underscore the point I'm trying to make really is I see a lot of inconsistency in the approach to this package of reforms that's intended to reduce the burden on business and, with this expectation that it will improve health and safety, although I have to say that there's no evidence presented in the Cabinet papers as to how that will happen. A simple question for you, Rebecca. Why are more than 70 Kiwis dying in the workplace every year still?
It's a good question. And I mean, I think, one of the reasons is that the potential of the law that was brought in post-Pike has not been realised. One of the things that really worries me, and has for some years, even before this package of reforms that Minister Van Velden has announced, I think that we're really good in this country at trivialising health and safety. It's kind of, it's health and safety gone mad. And, things like the establishment of a road cone hotline feeds that.
And what else does the government have a problem with? Road cones. So much so, they're proposing a hotline to dob in excessive use of road cones.
This is not trivial. As you say, 70, 80 workers a year are dying at work, and many thousands are injured and made sick at work. So this is real, and it's also fantastically costly. And for a country that's worried about its poor productivity, it's one of the first things that we should be dealing with. There's nothing more unproductive than a worker who can't walk anymore because of the failings of his or her employer to properly manage health and safety risks. So, I think the answer to your question, why are we happening? Because we're not doing it well. We lack a bipartisan consensus or a multi-party consensus on how to proceed well with good health and safety. We lack proper worker engagement. We lack the commitment to proper worker engagement in health and safety at work. And that looks likely to weaken even more under the other industrial relations reforms that the minister is rolling out. And we also, we have a lot of, we're a country of small businesses, and the barriers to entry are often very low. I mean, one of the cases that I wrote about in the newsroom pieces is just the most tragic story of a young man called Jarden Nelson who goes to work for a scaffolding company and he's electrocuted. And it's a tragic, awful story. Jarden is alive. He's still disabled as a result. The company that he went to work for was owned by a woman who owned a chain of fitness centres. She had no background in the scaffolding industry, which is a high-risk area. So we have these, on one hand, really low compliance aspects of the New Zealand business regime that mean that people can get into a sector where they don't have the technical knowledge, they don't have the background. And so as a result, Jarden's electrocuted at work. a really, really basic and very clear requirement regarding the management of overhead power lines was not attended to. The owner, and who's an owner-manager in this small business, didn't do what was required, and Jardine and his family will carry the cost of that for the rest of his life.
But will this change now under Van Velden's reforms?
No, I don't think it's going in the right direction.
To get it back on track, she wants more consistency and balance, more worker involvement, and an end to what she calls myth-making surrounding the industry.
I've been astonished. There were a couple of new documents that just came out, a regulatory impact statement that hadn't previously been released in another cabinet paper. I mean, these are the highest levels of, advice to cabinet. In the cabinet paper, it refers to the term health and safety-ism, as if, this is a joke or this is a sort of a triviality. And there's a reference even to this ridiculous story that happened a while ago about Santa parades needing seatbelts. Now, this is active myth-making. If people are making those risk decisions because they've, chosen to conclude that they need to do that to keep themselves safe from prosecution, I mean, they should probably check it out and read a bit more closely and maybe even question if they've hired a consultant to advise them, probably get a consultant that's got a better understanding of risk. Because I think this is really dangerous, this myth-making and this trivialisation, because, again, let's go back to people like Jardine, let's go back to people like the Pike 29, people like Misha Tremel, who I wrote about the other day. I mean, this is serious. This is a sphere that's absolutely full of tragedy and human harm. And it's also incredibly bad business. It's incredibly bad economically. There's nothing more unproductive than a worker who is so disabled they will never work again. So what we need here is an intelligent, inclusive conversation. We need a multi-party consensus to be rebuilt around health and safety. We don't need these sort of kind of throwaway lines that trivialise the risk to workers when workplaces are badly run and when companies, are not being adequately supported with the right, intelligent, well-developed guidance and regulation.
If you had 5 minutes with the Prime Minister or Minister Brooke Van Velden about these changes and what's at stake, what would you say?
I would say stop the myth-making, stop using language that trivialises this incredibly important area of work, acknowledge the need for further work to be done that we've known about and people have been begging to be done, and from businesses right through to unions for the last several years, rebuild the consensus around health and safety, take out the partisanship and put human lives, put workers' lives at the centre of it.
That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thank you to Rebecca McPhee and Laura Walters. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and engineered by Jeremy Veal. I'm Amanda Gillies. Mā te wā.